We're live.
Good morning. This is the House Judiciary Committee. It is the 3rd of February, 2022. This is our fiscal briefing. We're going to be getting a fiscal briefing from the Department of Legislative Services. And our goal here is to finish the briefing by about noon. Hopefully we'll have time for plenty of questions. From DLS, we're going to welcome Rebecca Ruff, the department's operating budget manager, and Maureen Merzlach from the Office of Policy Analysis. We'll hear from these panelists and then we'll open the floor to questions from the committee. So who would like to go first? Well,
good morning, Mr. Chair. I think Maureen is with us today to be able to share the document that I'm going to be speaking from to provide you all with the briefing on what's going on with the budget. I don't think she intends to be speaking this morning. So,
all right, then we'll just hear from you then. That'll be fine.
Wonderful.
So whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Thank you very much for having me. My name is Rebecca Ruff, and as the chair said, I'm one of the 2 operating budget managers for the Department of Legislative Services. We do have a briefing document that I believe has been provided to the committee for you all to peruse at your leisure, but as I mentioned, Maureen is planning to share the screen today so that we can all follow along together. So we're in a very, very different fiscal position than we were when you heard this briefing last year. We were projecting significant deficits in revenues this time last year. And this year, I come to you today to say that we're entering this session with a $4 billion general fund surplus. It's an extraordinary time. I'm told that we haven't seen anything like this in well over 30 years, and maybe even longer than that. And so what that does is it has allowed the governor to bring a budget plan that really does 3 key things. One, his plan allows for significant tax relief proposals. It includes substantial amounts of additional spending beyond what we had estimated when we put our baseline budget together this past fall. And then also it includes a significant amount of funds set aside for future use. So if you look at the chart on the top of the page before you, this shows you how the plan changes from fiscal 2022, the current fiscal year, to fiscal 2023 in total funds and by each of the individual funds. So looking overall, the budget actually declines by just under 6% or falls by almost $3.6 billion. And if you look at the detail by fund type, you can see that this decrease is really driven by a nearly $7.8 billion reduction in federal funds. And that's primarily reflective of the one-time federal stimulus assistance that is included in the 2022 plan that doesn't carry forward into the proposed budget. If you look at the general fund line, you can see that those increased by nearly 22% or about $4.6 billion. That's pretty substantial growth. A portion of that is attributable to the need to backfill some of the lost federal funds. But also included in that $4.6 billion number is a $2.4 billion appropriation to the rainy day fund. That's statutorily required because fiscal 2021 revenues closed much better than any of us expected. So statute requires that unassigned funds at the close of the fiscal year be swept into the next year's allowance. And so the governor has elected to appropriate that full amount, the full $2.4 billion into the rainy day fund with his fiscal 2023 budget, which leaves equivalent fund balance of nearly 16% in general fund revenues in that account, which is historic levels going back again over 30 years. We have not seen. I think the last highest amount in the rainy day fund was about 2007 when we were at 11%. So really, there's a lot of money in this budget and a significant amount of that has been set aside for future use. So if we were to ignore that $2.4 billion appropriation, I just want to point out that general fund spending would actually increase by about 13%. So still a lot of spending going on in this budget. One pot of spending that isn't currently reflected in the budget is federal funds associated with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That's largely a timing issue, just when the budget was passed and the fact that we're still waiting on a lot of guidance and decisions about how those funds will be allocated. But from what we know right now, we anticipate that over the next 5 years, Maryland will receive about $8.2 billion through that legislation. $1.5 billion of that is projected to be new or enhanced funds above what we would have otherwise received based on the existing programs. If you turn to the next slide, as I said, one of the key pillars of the governor's budget plan is to provide tax relief. And he really has three major components of his package, the biggest being to phase out income tax on retirement income. This is a multi-year plan that doesn't come to full fruition until fiscal 2028, which is beyond the scope of the forecast that the administration provides for the general fund. So we don't currently know the full impact of the governor's proposal. We are working on estimates. But what we do know right now is that based on the estimates that the administration has provided, this would be lost revenue of $188 million in fiscal 2023, growing to about $730 million in fiscal 2027. The second component is to eliminate the filing fee for businesses that file online. They typically pay around $300 annually for this service. And so if they were to pay online, they would no longer have to pay that fee, and that would reduce general fund revenues by about $36 million in the proposed budget, growing to $48 million in fiscal 2027. And the final component is that the governor is proposing to permanently implement the enhancements to the earned income tax credit. This was passed in legislation last session and currently goes through tax year 2022, which is why there's no reflected savings from this proposal in fiscal 2023. However, by making it permanent, it would be lost revenue of about $164 million by fiscal 2027. I would note that the governor's proposal does not extend the enhancement to the I-10 filers, which was legislation that was passed by the General Assembly last session. And so if that additional population were to be included in the enhancement, it would further reduce revenues by about $67 million each year. On the next page, this chart gives you an indication of the out-year forecast for the structural budget. So how we compare in terms of ongoing revenues and ongoing spending. It basically gives you an indication as to whether what the governor is proposing to do is affordable now and in the future. So if you look at this chart, the dark solid line shows where the structural surplus would be if there was no tax cuts. And the blue bars are where the administration projects that it would be with its tax package. And so you can see in both instances, the administration is saying that the budget plan that it's proposed is affordable. DLS has done a little bit of a preliminary investigation into the governor's numbers, and you can see, looking at the dotted line and the gray bars, that we do differ slightly, particularly when you get to fiscal 26 and 27. And that's really because we have different estimates for what education costs are, particularly as you get to the out years and general funds are required to begin to supplement the blueprint fund, which is used for the current implementation. So based on the DLS estimates and our education spending forecasts, we project that the budget will have a $409 million structural deficit by fiscal 2027. One other thing that I would note that's not reflected on this chart is the fact that it's likely that if you were to extend this chart to one more year, fiscal 2028, the picture would get much worse. And that's because fiscal 2028 is both the final phase in of the governor's tax proposal on the retirement income, so lost revenue, and also a significant increase in the amount of general funds needed to support Kerwin implementation. And so enhanced general fund spending. We will be working on a more complete and robust forecast of our own over the next few weeks, but at this point, we don't have that full picture for you. Moving on. The top of this page, as I mentioned, we're coming into this session with about a $4 billion general fund surplus. So the top of this page gives you a little bit of an overview as to how the governor's plan allocates that surplus. As I mentioned, he's included a significant amount of funds, about $2.7 billion set aside for savings or future use, cash balance, cash reserves. 2.4 billion of that is the rainy day fund appropriation, and he's included a general fund closing balance in fiscal 2023 of about 584 million, which is 315 million above what the Spending Affordability Committee had recommended in the fall. There's also $229 million in spending enhancements that we hadn't been anticipating when we put our baseline budget together. A good portion of this is associated with employee compensation enhancements, but there's also an additional $100 million included in the budget for addressing cybersecurity needs, and also some additional funds to support childcare providers. There's a smaller amount of money provided to cover one-time spending for unfunded liabilities and repayments for program open space. And then the other really big pot of money that we weren't projecting in our estimate is $910 million used for PAYGO capital, which contributes to a total capital budget of over $2 billion in fiscal 2023. The bottom half of this slide starts bullets that just provide you with some key features that we've found in our initial review of the budget. K-12 education funding increases by about 3.5% or $260 million. Although it's worth noting that DLS at this point has identified about $140 million in Kerwin associated costs that are not funded in this budget. The biggest piece being the education effort adjustment, forgive me. This is about $125 million. The funds were expected to go to Baltimore City and Prince George's County. The administration has determined that for fiscal 2023 only, they didn't believe this particular component of Kerwin to be a mandate and therefore opted not to fund it in fiscal 2023, but it is a component of funding that is in the forecast beginning in 2024 and carrying forward. There's a few other smaller items that we have later on in the analysis that are not mandated funding, but still associated with Kerwin implementation that we had anticipated seeing in the budget, but are not reflected in the allowances submitted by the governor. There is increased rates for providers. These range from about 3.25% to 4% increases, depending on the provider type. There's also over $100 million in additional funds provided for crime prevention and victim services, and I will get into a little bit more detail about what those are towards the end of the presentation. As I mentioned, there's significant funding set aside for multi-year expenditures addressing cybersecurity needs. And on the next slide, this notes that there is 19% increase for the University System of Maryland. This largely backfills reductions that they had taken last year when we thought the fiscal situation for the state was much more dire. Because the formulas and funding increases so significantly for the four-year institutions, this also has a significant impact in boosting funds available for community colleges and non-public institutions as well. As I mentioned, you may have heard, the governor has provided significant increases for employee compensation. This includes specific bonuses in fiscal 2022, as well as cost of living adjustments and increments. The COLAs and increments also carry forward and into fiscal 2023. The exact amounts vary by bargaining unit, and the document that's provided to you does include more detail on that for you to take a look at as your interest desires. But in total, it increases the budget by about $832 million. With regard to the capital budget, I mentioned the PAYGO spending. I would also just note that there is $50 million in GO bonds reserved for legislative priorities and an additional $51 million funding prior authorizations that you all identified as priorities from last session. And the bottom half of this slide, and continuing on to the next slide, just gives you a general idea of some of the issues that we think you as the legislature will have to consider as you move forward in making your decisions on the budget. Number one is you'll have to decide what you'd like to do in response to the governor's proposals for tax relief. You'll also want to consider what is the appropriate balance in terms of maintaining cash reserves versus identifying additional spending and addressing additional spending needs. It's very common amongst states to keep a balance of about 10% in the rainy day fund in order to ward off against future recessions. Spending Affordability had recommended a balance of about 9%. As I said, the governor has come in with a full near 16%. On the next slide, this is the chart that I had mentioned that provides the detail as to the areas in education that aren't funded associated with Kerwin. As I said, it's about $140 million. We have consulted with the AGs to get an opinion on the issue of whether the education effort adjustment is a mandate for this year or not. We're awaiting a determination from them on that, but we do feel pretty favorable about that. To the extent that we are able to allocate infrastructure funds in the budget through a supplemental down the road, you may have an interest in opining on how those funds are used. There will be an issue in terms of addressing the long-term sustainability of the Blueprint Fund associated with Kerwin, as I mentioned when we were talking about the structural budget. Beginning in fiscal 26 and 27, general funds will be needed to support Kerwin implementation. So given the amount of surplus right now, you may want to choose to set aside some of that funding in order to ward off future general fund need. And then the other last issue that I would just highlight right now is the question of what to do with state employees. In terms of hiring and retention. Right now, most state agencies are facing vacancy rates above 10%. I'm sure that you have all heard of the Great Resignation that's going on right now. Issues with staffing are not unique to the public sector. And as I mentioned, the governor has included substantial enhancements in terms of compensation, but it remains to be seen whether that is enough to really make a dent in what is becoming a significant concern across all facets of the state government workforce. So with that, if we just want to jump forward to page 17, I just wanted to briefly cover a little bit more specifically what the public safety related funding enhancements are in the governor's budget. You may have heard him announce a $500 million initiative, the Refund the Police initiative. This is a multi-year initiative that extends for fiscal 2022 all the way through fiscal 2025. And that's how he gets to the $500 million. In the budget that is before you for consideration, there's actually only about $155 million, which is about 30%. Of the initiative funded through the remainder of the governor's term. Within that, the majority of the funding is an increase to the state aid for police protection formula. This is $45 million in additional funding in fiscal 2023. It is spread across all the jurisdictions, with the larger counties receiving increases between $6 and $8 million. And also there's a new appropriation in this formula of $8 million to Baltimore City. Previously, the city had not been included in the state aid for police protection, going back some 30 years as part of a deal for the state taking over the Baltimore City jail operations. Included in the Refund the Police initiative is also about $18 million in fiscal 23 for police scholarships and police accountability resources, body cameras, training, equipment, etc. These actually fulfill requirements of the Maryland Police Accountability Act of 2021. And then the other thing that I would just note is that last line with regard to victim services and Voca providers. The $20 million in fiscal 2022 is actually federal ARPA funds that are used to help make Voca providers whole in the current budget year. It appears that the fiscal 23 funding for Voca is at that near $47 million level. The $6 million in fiscal 23 and going forward is general fund enhancements to cover the costs of the bulleted programs that you see there in the middle of the page. Outside the Refund the Police initiative, there is additional money provided for other public safety enhancements. This includes $8 million for justice reinvestment grants. There is the full $4.7 million provided in fiscal 23 for the Violence Intervention and Prevention Fund and associated programs. There's $2.5 million provided for rape kit testing grants. And then there's a $2 million bump for the Protection Against Hate Crimes grants, bringing the funding amount for that program up to $5 million. With that is the conclusion of the presentation that I have for you today. I'm happy to take any questions.
Right, are there questions? Delegate Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Ms. Ruff, for the great presentation. Two quick questions. First of all, going back to the beginning, the filing fee, the business filing fee that you mentioned, I think it costs about $36 million to waive the filing fee for small businesses. I guess that would be for LLCs. It's a $300 fee. Was there any indication from the executive's office as to what the purpose was? Is that to incentivize more businesses to file in Maryland? And if so, does DLS have any information as to whether there's a better policy to try and encourage businesses to come to Maryland versus, a $300 fee that is basically used to make sure that we have a department that can monitor businesses? That way, do you want me to give you my question number two, or do you want to talk about that?
Well, so tax policy is not my forte or area of specialty. So I'm not sure. I can follow up with our other analysts to see if there's a good resource for you on the latter half of that first question. We are still looking at the bills and putting together the estimates. I think the governor in his plan and his statements has alluded to trying to encourage businesses to come to Maryland, but I can't speak specifically as to the intent. Administration has not expressed anything specific to me.
Right. And the next question is a little bit bigger. It's dealing with the retirement, the waiving of taxes on retirement income. It's about $700 million, $650 million or something over the course of 8 years. And the question is, has there been any analysis as to whether just waiving taxes on perhaps the first $50,000 versus, or the first $20,000 versus all retirement income, so that we can maybe, help every Marylander to a certain extent, but perhaps help the ones who are in a more vulnerable situation more, because if somebody only has, $10,000 in retirement income, but somebody else has $25,000, maybe we should only, waive the first 10 grand. Is there anything that DLS has done on that? I know you're not a tax expert, but I'm just wondering if there's anything there.
Right now, we are in the process of finishing up our analysis and fiscal note on the administration's bill and proposal as it is, which is to eventually eliminate the income tax on all retirement income. We have not done any type of additional analysis about alternative models, although as you all consider what alternatives you'd like, certainly our resources are available to you to help you figure out what that would look like.
Okay, Delegate Grammer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for being here today and presenting. I've been working the retirement, the taxation of retirement income issue for some time now. I just have one question. Do you know what the state revenues are for, let's say, the past 3 years? Like the revenues we've taken in to pay our obligations via taxes and fees and all of the things that go into the budget?
Total revenues? I don't have that offhand, but I can certainly provide it for you. And as far as general fund revenues, it is probably in the material. In fact, I'm certain that it's in the materials, but I can provide that to you.
Thanks so much.
following the meeting.
Delegate Shetty.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much to our DLS team for providing this really helpful briefing. We really appreciate it. I wanted to go back to the Voca funding, and I was curious if you happen to know whether the 47 million was sufficient to cover programs like new needs from the pandemic and from the resignations that we're seeing across the state.
Our analysts are in the process of sorting through the Voca program and the amount of funding. The federal funds are awarded to us, not necessarily based on the amount of need or application that we have received amount from the federal government through that program, and then they're allocated out. The $47 million is consistent with what the funding level has tried to achieve in the last few years. You may or may not be aware that GOCP-YVS, which administers Voca, has had several accounting issues with that program. So we are still trying to sort out the details as best we can in terms of that funding. It will be covered in that agency's analysis and discussed, but I'm not sure that we have detailed or accurate information to be able to comment or evaluate the extent to which the amount of funding awarded or provided is fulfilling the full need.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Delegate McComas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a rather brief question, and if you can't tell me now, you could tell me later. I heard from somebody else who had been through the briefings that the counties were receiving about $500 million or $500 million that I don't think was earmarked. It may be earmarked for different things, but is that correct? Or could you find out how much the counties are getting in extra money from this budget?
Are you from the state's budget, or are you referring to the infrastructure bill?
Well, I guess if it's federal funds, or if it's they're giving county funds, or they're getting money from the state. In other words, I got the impression from who told me, they said, you know, when we have our briefing, I should check on it. So I guess it's just a big pot of money that they're gonna. It's a nice rainfall.
Okay. Yes, I can get you that information.
Okay, thank you.
Are there further questions? Going once. Delegate Shoemaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one question with regard to the governor's public safety proposals. Are there, or is there specific money earmarked in his proposal to reimburse local jurisdictions for the body cameras that are required under the police reform legislation that was passed last year?
Yes, there is $8 million annually beginning in fiscal 2023 for the police accountability resources. And it's our understanding that that encompasses body cameras and training and other equipment associated with that.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Last chance for questions. All right, seeing no further, I'm sorry, I think Delegate Howell, there we go. Delegate Howell, where'd you go? There you are. Go ahead with your question.
Good morning. Thank you for this briefing. I live in Prince George's County, and I'm still very curious about the elimination of funding to Prince George's and Baltimore City. And I just would like a further explanation on that as to why the funding was taken out or not funded.
So it's our understanding, and all that we've received from the administration is that in putting together the budget, it was their determination that that component was not a mandated amount of funding under Kerwin. And so for fiscal 23 only, they opted to not include those funds in the budget. As I said, we're awaiting a official determination of that from the AG's office. And I think we feel relatively confident that they will identify it as a mandate, in which case we would expect to see it provided through a supplemental budget. But as far as what I know right now, the administration decided that it was discretionary in fiscal 23 and opted not to include the funding.
So if the funding does get allocated, when will it be allocated? In 23, 24?
Yes, I think that if it was identified as a mandate, we would expect to see it introduced in a supplemental budget this session for fiscal 2023 funding.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate Cardin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one more quick question. There was a slide that you showed that had about $500 million in spending on, I think it was mostly the crime prevention legislation. And I'm assuming it's dependent on the passage of legislation. If, for example, a bill that would require significant funding does not pass, where does that money go and how is it reallocated?
The funding included in the governor's refund the police initiative is not tied to any legislation. It's just enhancements that he's included in the budget. 18 million of the 155 million in the budget introduced this year is in order to fulfill statutory requirements from the Police Accountability Act that you all passed last session. But the rest of it is at his discretion. And so it's there and available. A portion of it is capital funds. And a portion of it is the compensation enhancements for SLEOLA members, for the policing units and things like that. So those are collectively bargained agreements that are already in place and funded in the budget. But so the funds are there and they're there to be spent in the programs unless you all opt to cut those funds or restrict them in some way through amendments to the budget, directing the governor to spend them in an alternative fashion.
Thank you.
All right, Delegate Tolles.
Good morning. I just wanted to make a statement in support of my colleague, Delegate Howe. While I know it's not anything that this committee can make, changes that this committee will make, I do want to point out that the lack of funding for Prince George's County, while we're still in a pandemic for education, is concerning. And I think particularly our children are in need of mental health resources, social services, and so many issues that plague our school system, particularly in Prince George's County, and the support of funding our school system to the best of its ability is critically important still during these times. And I can speak to experience from that because I was in that role several years ago, where the funding that came from, as a former council member, the funding that came from the state was very critical in funding our schools. So it's no need for comment, but I do think, it's concerning and something that should be pointed out. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Further questions? All right, seeing none, we do thank you very much, Ms. Ruff, for being here and giving us our fiscal briefing for the year. Greatly appreciate that. I think that'll conclude the fiscal briefing, unless Delegate Tolles is coming back for a second. Nope, she's not. Seeing no further questions, we thank you all very much. That'll conclude the fiscal briefing. We'll be back at 1 o'clock for bill hearings.